Greetings, dear viewer, and welcome to Purposes Crossed, where I hope that people who are called by Jesus for different purposes cross paths and exchange ideas. In this video, we continue with our series of devotions on the Psalms, and today we will deal with Psalm 22. Due to the fact that Jesus quotes the first verse of this psalm from the cross, this psalm is often taken as a prophetic psalm. However, since the psalms are poetry set to music, what would a prophecy look like in a psalm? Since we have this question to ask and hopefully answer, we will devote 3 of these videos to Psalm 22. In this first video, we will look at the genre of prophecy in the Psalms. In the second video, we will look at the Old Testament context of the Psalm and attempt to interpret it without reference to the New. In the third video, we will look at how the cry of dereliction uttered by Jesus on the cross changes our interpretation and understanding of the Psalm. So how do we approach supposed prophecies in the Psalms? The Psalms is a collection of songs, both private and corporate, that the people of Israel used to help them understand their relationship with Yahweh, who had called them and made a covenant with them. Since the Psalms are sung poetry, we should be careful not to interpret them as prose. So, for example, when David sings, "All who see me mock at me, and they make mouths at me," we may think that this is intended to be a prophecy that should be taken literally, because this is precisely what happened when Jesus was crucified. But what then do we make of the words, "Many bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me"? This certainly cannot be literal, for there were no bovines at the cross. Similarly, we may think that "my mouth is dried up like a potsherd and my tongue sticks to my jaws" is to be literal because this is what crucifixion would involve. However, "my hands and feet have shriveled" did not happen literally. So the question arises, with such fluidity of language, how do we decide beforehand which parts should be understood literally and which are symbolic? And the beforehand is crucial, or we can just look back and identify a prophecy and use it as we wish. Some Jewish objections to Christian understandings of Psalm 22 hinge on this matter. We seem to be engaging in special pleading when we say that Psalm 22 prophesies a crucifixion, but interprets some parts literally and other parts figuratively. However, the most common rabbinic interpretation of Psalm 22 from after Jesus' crucifixion asserts that while David composed the psalm, it reached its fulfillment when Esther recited it when she was about to enter the court of Ahasuerus and risked her life in the process. They go on to say that the deer of the dawn is a cryptic reference to Esther. So which interpretation is more likely? What we need to observe is that the common Christian and Jewish interpretations apply the psalm to context not directly referenced in the psalm. Also, both interpretations require a mixture of literal and metaphorical understandings of the psalm. We could see which interpretation has more literal or more metaphorical elements, and here it is clear that the Christian interpretation has more literal elements than the Jewish interpretation. However, this does not mean that we can conclude that the Christian interpretation is better. After all, once you accept a metaphorical meaning, there is no point counting which is more literal. The Jewish interpretation would be valid were it not for another element. When discussing why Esther is the deer of the dawn, Jewish interpreters insist that she marked the end of the miracles of God, the last one being the one based on which Purim was instituted. However, Jewish interpreters would also accept the miracle under the Maccabees that produced the festival of Hanukkah. If Esther marks the end of miracles, then, in order to be consistent, Jewish interpreters would have to reject the Hanukkah miracle. On the grounds of having a consistent hermeneutic, therefore, I would reject the common Jewish interpretation. What all of this has uncovered are 2 crucial points. First, it is quite easy to find a reference to a poem because the genre involves a fluid and compact use of language. Hence, it is important that we do not base any doctrine on poetry. Poetry may provide some supporting evidence, but it should not be used as the mainstay that props up any doctrine. For example, Christians often support the belief that God is omnipresent by quoting Psalm 139 verses 7 through 12. But this is disingenuous because we need to employ a consistent hermeneutic, or we can just pull any interpretation out of a hat like a common magician. When it comes to prophecy and poetry, and this is not restricted to the Psalms, we need to accept that it is highly likely that any interpretation we give after an event is not something that those who lived before the event would have been able to recognize. We may go back and admire the so-called predictive power of the scriptures, But we should also admit that it is highly unlikely that anyone before Jesus' crucifixion ever thought that Psalm 22 is a prophetic psalm or ascribed to it the meaning that most Christians believe it has. It was likely used just as a generic psalm of lament when a worshipper was in dire straits. This does not take away from the psalm. And in the next video in the series, we will see how this psalm can be interpreted with only the Old Testament in mind.